people are free to choose, they choose freedom.
She was in the business of liberation, the liberation of the proletariat.
Thatcher was a revolutionary radical.
The left portrays Margaret as an establishment figure, but she wasn't at all.
We were radical against an establishment which we felt didn't share the spoils very well or very fairly.
Margaret Thatcher was a subversive figure. We were a subversive government.
This is the story of a working-class revolution and the woman who led it.
Working class people were moving up the ladder. Suddenly it's guys coming in from Essex, not people coming in from Eton.
Free market economics has delivered prosperity on a mass scale that is unprecedented in human history.
Cortina man, Essex man, you name it. She understood their aspirations.
And yet, we're accused of looking after the rich. It was exactly the opposite of what happened.
This story is about how Margaret Thatcher stole the working class.
What really annoys people on the left is she started converting who they thought were their own people.
Selfish individualism is, I want something better for my children, I want something better out of my life than my parents had. If that's selfish individualism, roll on.
This is the story of how the new prosperity and influence of ordinary people offended Britain's traditional ruling class.
Suddenly these people who were supposed to be in the working classes are now driving nice cars, living in nice houses.
Ordinary people were going into the same grocer's shops as they were.
The Essex men, with their flashy wives and their flashy cars, were just talked about as if they were vermin.
This is a story about how the traditional Tory establishment turned on the revolutionary in its midst.
She was turning the world upside down. After all, they were conservatives. They didn't like change.
Thrown out by her own toffs.
The Tory party was taking its party back.
This is the story of Margaret Thatcher.
We will tell the people the truth, and the people will be our judge.
Margaret Thatcher is dead. Who will grieve and who will celebrate? My name is Martin Durkin, and I'm setting out to find out who loved and who hated Margaret Thatcher and why. The question is not as straightforward as you might think. For example, although people on the left clearly dislike her, it's not always easy to pin down precisely why.
You say we shouldn't renationalise industries, and you wouldn't go back to exchange controls, and you wouldn't reverse the trade union reforms. There are so many things that she did that people say they wouldn't reverse, and yet she's still hated.
Where there is no rationale for changing a main avenue of policy, why change it? There's absolutely no point in doing it. Mrs. Thatcher didn't denationalise.
So she was right.
No, she wasn't right.
What her friends and enemies seem to agree on is that the Thatcher Revolution, as it became known, changed Britain forever.
I was someone who grew up in the 1980s and watched what she did, very difficult decisions. And as I said, she was absolutely on the right side of the big arguments. And in a way, the biggest legacy and testament to her was that the governments that came after her, even though there were Labour governments that had complained bitterly about what she had done, they kept what she had done.
There is something topsy-turvy about the support for Margaret Thatcher. She was a Tory, and the Tories are meant to be on the side of the toffs. And yet many members of the traditional ruling class hated her almost as much as the left.
Excuse me, ma'am. It's that woman.
Oh, no! What does she want?
Good evening, ma'am.
She was even hated by members of the upper-class establishment in her own party.
The establishment on the whole were always very suspicious of her, the old establishment. The aristocratic establishment of this country never quite took to Margaret.
Margaret Thatcher was certainly not a member of the Bullingdon Club, let's put it like that.
Among Britain's high-minded intelligentsia, meanwhile, she was generally despised. Stephen Fry called her a shameful putrid scab, an embarrassingly ludicrous monstrosity who makes one ashamed to be British. Elvis Costello wrote one of several songs looking forward to Margaret Thatcher's death.
I mean, that song in Billy Elliot, "Every Day is One Day Nearer to Margaret Thatcher Dying."
The way that she was talked about, the way that she was hated and reviled by people who were so deeply threatened by what she represented, was one of the most shameful passages in modern British history.
And yet by many ordinary people, Mrs. Thatcher was admired and even loved.
Out here in working-class Basildon, for example, among the shop assistants and builders and taxi drivers, you'll find some of her most enthusiastic supporters.
I think she was really good.
I really did like her.
I think she did the right thing for the country.
I thought she was the best thing since sliced bread, really.
She stuck to her principles. Not like today. There's no one around like her today.
I suspect it is people from what is sometimes disparagingly called Middle England who will be lining the route of Mrs. Thatcher's funeral. They will be there not because she stood up for the toffs, but because she transformed the lives of ordinary working Britons.
To understand how and why, we need to look at where Margaret Thatcher came from and the Britain into which she was born. So I've come to the market town of Grantham to visit a little flat above a corner shop where a girl called Margaret Roberts was born and grew up.
And here it is, or here it was. Now it's a chiropractic clinic and holistic retreat. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts lived upstairs in the flat with their daughters Muriel and Margaret. There was no hot running water, not even a radio until Margaret was in her teens. This was not a posh upbringing, but Margaret loved it. Later in her memoirs, she said, looking back, she realised what a thoroughly decent place Grantham was.
Margaret's father came from a family of cobblers. He left school at 13 and became a grocery boy and slowly saved enough to open his own grocery shop. He met his wife Beatrice at Methodist Church. Her father worked on the railway. They made a home in the flat above Alf's shop and had 2 children, Muriel and Margaret. Her father Alf was one of the great influences in her life. Margaret later described him as an old-fashioned liberal. He loved to read and loved to talk about ideas, and Margaret loved to listen.
The fundamental upbringing of her parents, and I think more particularly her father, never left her. And I think they made, just as I say her moral courage was the mark that her father left upon her, I think her entire being reflected her upbringing in Grantham.
The young Margaret played the organ in the local Methodist church, where her father was a lay preacher. Alf's liberalism and Christianity gave him a profound moral attachment to freedom. Freedom was worth fighting for and defending. When Margaret wasn't helping her father in church, she worked with him in the shop, and what she learnt here would stay with her the rest of her life.
Mrs. Thatcher said, although the left liked to depict capitalism as alien and harsh, to her, growing up here in Grantham, it was familiar and creative. Her father had been able to grow his business because he met the needs of his customers. He liked his customers, and his customers liked him.
It's 95 there.
Free economic activity wasn't a source of oppression, but a means of advancement. It didn't make us poorer, it made us richer.
The market was not a wicked thing. It was lively and human and sociable. She knew that it was international trade which brought tea and coffee and sugar and spices into the shops. It was international trade that brought Fred Astaire to the local cinema.
Alf taught Margaret well, and she won a place here at the local grammar school. In 1943, she was elected head girl. The young Margaret was bright, hard-working, and ambitious. At 5, she was playing the piano. At 10, she was reading Milton. And in her teens, she was reading heavy political theory, including books by communist authors.
In fact, she was so clever, she won a scholarship when she was 17 to study chemistry at Oxford University. So the girl from the grocer's shop in Grantham comes to Oxford University. How exciting. And she's desperate to take part in those famous Oxford Union debates. But she's a woman, and they don't let women in. She is able to join the Oxford Conservative Association, but immediately she starts to criticise Conservative Party policy. In fact, she writes a paper saying that, in the eyes of the public, the Conservatives represent, in her words, the prejudices and selfish interests of the moneyed classes. Radical stuff. But it went down well with her fellow students, who sent her as their delegate to a big Tory conference in London. And Margaret used her first ever conference speech to call for more working class involvement in Conservative politics.
At Oxford, for the first time, Margaret came up against social prejudice and snobbery. In an effort to fit in, she discreetly dropped the Grantham accent.
I don't think you could have been an undergraduate in the 40s and early 50s in Oxford from Margaret Thatcher's background without thinking it was a world of privilege, and of course it was.
But at Oxford she discovered something quite extraordinary about the privileged upper classes. They weren't very keen on capitalism. In her memoirs, she said she found that conservatives from an elevated social background found economic liberalism alien and uncongenial.
I think the English upper classes weren't keen on capitalism because capitalism replaces status, replaces rank and hierarchy. The fact that they are so-and-so's son no longer matters because merit is going to take other people past them.
The Conservative Party had in it a very strong stream of the landed interest. People who were wealthy, inherited wealth, who were not very keen on a competitive world in which others might seek to acquire some of their wealth or surpass them.
People who made money and who didn't come from the right genteel backgrounds, they were the ones that class of Tories really feared and despised. Ambition itself was an offensive word. It was vulgar. It was crass. You weren't supposed to be ambitious. You were supposed to be there already. You were supposed to have either been born there or you didn't belong there.
Pictures like this always make you wonder if you may be looking at a future Prime Minister.
The upper classes were more likely to go into the army or senior civil service or politics than start a little business.
There was this big part of the Tory party, which was a landed interest, which looked down on trade, didn't have much time for commerce.
There was almost a snobbery about it, a disdain for people who got their hands muddy with the dirt of the real world.
The upper-class Tory establishment thought it was their job to run the country. Their fear of the market and love of state control drew many senior Tories towards a right-wing form of socialism.
Fascism is new to Great Britain. They turn to this new creed for salvation when the old world begins to collapse.
So the old aristocratic class were attracted to National Socialism because they thought that would protect their position.
Yes. It was those who wanted to keep things as they were who were sympathetic to the concept of fascism.
Leaving Oxford, Margaret got a job as a research chemist and met and married Dennis Thatcher, who came from Lewisham and worked for his father's paint business. In 1950, Margaret stood as Tory candidate in Dartford, where Labour enjoyed a huge majority. But Mrs. Thatcher, instead of mixing with the local knobs, went into parts of town the Tories usually avoided to canvass among the working class. The result was astonishing. She increased the Tory vote by over 7,000. Nevertheless, persuading the Tory party to give her a winnable seat was a monumental struggle. After all, she was a woman, and what's worse, a grocer's daughter.
She did have a tough time. You know, it wasn't easy for her by any stretch of the imagination.
Well-wishers besiege Caxton Hall, London, for the wedding of Britain's popular Foreign Secretary, Mr. Anthony Eden, to Miss Clarissa Spencer Churchill.
In the post-war period, the Tory party was still run by the upper classes.
Macmillan's best example, Alec Douglas, Hume, Eden, these were people from very posh backgrounds.
The upper-class Tory establishment agreed with Labour socialists that the state should directly control much of the economy. This was called the post-war consensus. The extent of nationalisation under both Labour and Tory governments was breathtaking. The ports and the docks and shipbuilding were nationalised. The trains and the railways, freight transport, canals, ferries and buses were nationalised. The airports and airlines, car, bus, truck and airplane manufacturing, the coal industry, the oil industry, the gas industry, the steel industry, iron, water, electricity were all nationalised. Telecommunications were nationalised. Much of the computer industry, radio and television were nationalised. The government even took over some pubs and the travel agent Thomas Cook. Britain, once the world's leading capitalist industrial nation, became one of the most state-owned of any country outside the communist world.
You might wake up in the morning and brush your teeth with state water, get into your state-produced car, avoiding state-produced lorries and buses. You might pick up your state telephone, phone the state travel agent, book a holiday taking off from a state airport in a state-produced aircraft, and so it went on. You could go through the entire day without ever contacting the free enterprise side of the economy.
Mrs. Thatcher was finally elected to Parliament in 1959.
Talk of the front bench. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we'll just try to be a very good backbencher first.
It was a grim time for Britain. According to the post-war consensus, nationalisation would bring prosperity. But instead, Britain suffered a period of rapid decline.
The problem with state industries was basically that being a monopoly, funded from the public purse, they didn't have to try. Private enterprise keeps itself efficient and cost-effective because otherwise people will turn to their competition and they'll go broke.
When you're working in an environment like that and you see it day in, day out, you can see what's going on. The management what was looking after the works just didn't care about the costs. They just let it go because they knew that if they lost money, the government would pay for it.
By the 1970s, state-owned Britain was on its knees, outdated and overmanned. The nationalised industries were making huge losses. They were not producing wealth, they were consuming it. Britain, once the workshop of the world, was now the sick man of Europe.
British Steel, British Telecom, British Gas, it doesn't matter. If it had the word British in front of it, it was basically nationalised and was completely on its backside. And it represented where the country was as well. The country was on its backside.